I don't think people realize how serious it is, though. I was at the meeting in Winooski a couple months ago where there was a nuclear engineer, and he pointed out that the nuclear waste will be stored in several containers on site, and the containers will be cement. But if a terrorist shot into one of the containers, or if an airplane crashed on top of one of the containers, there could be a nuclear meltdown. And so I asked him, well, how big an area would become unlivable for the next 100,000 years? And he said, well, down to Springfield, Massachusetts. And I guess that would reach up to maybe Rutland or Killington, too. And imagine, for 100,000 years, you wouldn't be able to live there.
It would certainly be a pretty bad day for Vermont. But here's the question. How do we responsibly deal with this bad hand that we've been dealt? And I think we need a governor who's going to stand up to Entergy Louisiana, who's going to make them pay, and who's going to hold them accountable. You know, there's another shorter, you've just raised a long-term question. There's another long-term question, which is these dry casks that they've designed and put in place are only good for 100 years. And there isn't an engineer in the country, I don't believe, that's figured out how to transfer that substance to another cask, or whatever it's going to be, to get us through the next 100 years. In other words, we're not really thinking well on this one. The other problem is the question of what happens with the plant itself. Entergy Louisiana is bound and determined to do something called, quote-unquote, safe store, which means they're going to leave the carcass of the plant on the banks of the Connecticut River while the fund builds up for 60, 70 years. That wasn't the deal either. The deal was that we'd return it to a greenfield. And we need a governor who's going to say to Entergy Louisiana and the NRC and President Obama and work with our congressional delegation to say, we're not doing that. When you do shut it down, we want it cooled off and then taken away. That was the promise. That's what has to happen, and you've got to pay for it, not the ratepayers of the state of Vermont.
How is the fund going to build up after the plant is closed?
The only way the fund will build up is if Entergy Louisiana takes some of the money that they're giving to their CEO, Wayne Leonard, $325 million, and puts it in the fund to keep the promise that they made. They will avoid doing that until a governor turns to them and says, you have to. The Doobie Douglas team has been a better advocate for Entergy Louisiana than their own shareholders. They've been a wholly owned subsidiary. One of the things that Brian has said to me is, I disagree with you on VY, I'd like to relicense it. My gosh, it seems like it could almost melt down and these folks would want to relicense it. I mean, we need a governor who is going to stand up to these folks, stand up to the special interest, to the money, to the power of Entergy Louisiana, and say no. And you know, I understand that I go into this election as the #1 enemy in America of Entergy Louisiana. And I know that they'll do everything they can to take me out in this election. But my guess is that Vermonters would rather have a governor who isn't beholden to Entergy Louisiana, but is beholden to them. And that's the gamble I'm taking in this election.
This $325 million that the CEO is getting, is that $325 million a year?
It was over about 3 years, and it was stock options.
So he's getting roughly $110 million a year to take home. That must be hard for him to live on that.
I imagine it's tough to get by in $110 million.
And he needed a tax cut. This is the man that George Bush gave the tax cuts to.
Well, that's how politics works now. That's what's wrong with America. Yeah. We're, really, fundamentally, Bernie Sanders is absolutely right about this one. This country has decimated the poor, has decimated the middle class, and government has been beholden to those that have the most. And we've now built a tax structure on a federal level where that's true. One of the things I'm proud of in Vermont is, in Vermont, we actually have a very progressive tax system. We ask those with the most. I've been one of those individuals at times, I do well in my business, who should pay the most, and we do. But on a national level, more and more of the federal programs are designed to let the super rich off the hook and make everybody else pay. And it's really a disaster for a country, and frankly to our democracy. The middle class is the only thing that keeps America great. And it really is a tremendously big problem that people feel their economic security slipping away. You know, as I travel around the state, I meet people every day who say to me, I went into do a radio show recently, and I was getting a cup of coffee, and a man came up to me, he looked a little older than me, and he said, Peter, he said, I've been a builder all my life. I can't find a job. 2.5 years. I hate not working. I've taken some painting jobs, a few other little things, but I can't get back to work. He said, I don't have the skills, the technology skills to get a job that I would like to get. I'm not qualified. You know, that man needs to be retrained for the 21st century jobs. I'll get that done as governor. I talked to a woman up in Burlington recently who said to me, I lost my job 3 years ago. I now have 3 jobs. I'm barely patching it all together, and I'm now just lost one of my 3, so I'm down to 2. I can't pay my bills. So, you know, we all talk about the unemployed. That's a huge problem. We have more unemployed people in Vermont than we had 8 years ago, by a long shot, more than we've had in 30 years. But there's also this huge group of Vermonters who have jobs, but find their incomes are stagnant, their bills are mounting, and they can't keep up, and that's who I'm going to be fighting for.
What about the proposed spin-off of the Vermont Yankee plant to Nexus? If it is relicensed, Nexus is a company which will have $4.5 billion in debt and whose only asset will be 6 aging nuclear power plants. Is this still something that Vermonters should be worried about? Is there any way to stop this if the plant should be relicensed?
Well, I was one of the early critics of the Nexus spinoff back when it wasn't particularly fashionable. And I said this is the best example of Wall Street trying to bilk Main Street and bilk Vermonters than anything you've ever seen. I mean, what these guys were going to do was they were going to go to Entergy Louisiana was going to go to a closing. They were going to basically sell their assets, these 6 old nuclear power plants, to a spin-off shell company for $4 billion. That's billion, not million. They were going to put $3.5 billion in their shareholders' pockets, pay down the rest of their debt, and they were gone. What we were going to have left was a company that then needed to go borrow junk bond for additional billion because they had no money to run the company. So it was going to be this plant that we have down here in Vernon, 5 others, and roughly $5.3 billion worth of debt. And that was going to be our new partner. So we made a lot of noise about that. And luckily, the New York Public Service Board, which was part of this deal because 2 of these plants are in New York, ruled recently that they wouldn't approve this crazy spinoff. So Entergy is now regrouping, trying to think of a different solution. God knows what they'll come up with, but make no mistake about it, they want to cash in and run. Frankly, if I were them, we might consider doing the same thing when you get a bunch of old nuclear power plants that are leaking and having other problems. They want to get rid of the liability. They've been very honest about that. And we've got to be very sure that we have a governor who ensures that they don't get away with it.
Some of our viewers may not really understand the economic manipulation involved here, but by selling basically worthless old nuclear power plants and getting the money, Entergy walks away, and then later, when it comes time to clean things up or if there's a nuclear accident, the spin-off company will be in debt, so they won't have any money.
Right.
And they'll just go bankrupt. And so the people of Vermont will have to pick up the tab, right?
Right. I mean, this deal makes Fairpoint look like kids play. The plan is that you take all the money out of your assets, you put it in your stockholders' pockets, make them wealthy, and leave the people of Vermont and the people who have the other 5 plants stuck with the liability. When something goes wrong, you bankrupt the company and you run. Now, this might sound like pie in the sky, but it's interesting to note that that's exactly what Entergy Louisiana did after Katrina hit in Louisiana. They bankrupted the shell company that provided the power to Louisiana, and they walked away. And the federal government ended up picking up the tab. So they do this, they do it well, and that's clearly what they were intending to do here.
Mm-hmm.